If you work at Boeing, it's been a pretty demoralizing 2 decades or so. First, there was all the outsourcing to cut costs following the company's move to Chicago. And then 2 of the company's brand new MAX aircraft plummeted from the sky, killing hundreds of people because the plane's state-of-the-art safety software put them in a nosedive. And then a door blew off one of the company's passenger planes mid-flight over Portland, apparently because Boeing factory workers shipped the thing without installing 4 very important bolts, though I imagine every bolt on an airplane is very important. And that triggered a criminal investigation, led to the grounding of more than 100 aircraft. And then 2 planes, a Boeing 757 and a Boeing 777, lost a tire and a wheel on takeoff, respectively, and all of it was caught on video. Now, amid all these disasters, employees at Boeing could console themselves with one fact, which is that commercial airplanes aren't the only product lines that Boeing develops. The company has what's known as a diversified portfolio. And a big part of that portfolio is their space division. In particular, more than a decade ago, after NASA retired its space shuttles, Boeing partnered with NASA to build space capsules and other equipment to transport astronauts into low Earth orbit. And that part of Boeing's business, the part where they work with NASA instead of commercial aviation companies, has been relatively humiliation and disaster-free, all things considered. Or at least it's been relatively humiliation and disaster-free until now. In a story that's not getting anywhere near as much attention as it should, Boeing's Starliner capsule began to malfunction as it approached the International Space Station in early June. 5 of the Starliner's thrusters stopped working, which is a big deal when you only have 28 thrusters in total. It's about 20% of your thrust. If you do some kind of back of the envelope math on that, that's what you find. In response, ground controllers did what you do when your computer starts acting strangely. They shut the thrusters down and they rebooted them. 4 of the thrusters ultimately came back online, but NASA was never entirely sure what had gone wrong, and the thrusters weren't the only major malfunction. The propulsion system also suffered 5 helium leaks, including a large one that was leaking 395 psi per minute. Now, throughout all of this, Boeing insisted that the Starliner was safe enough to bring the 2 astronauts back home. They said that everybody was confident in the Starliner spacecraft and its ability to return safely with crew, quote, unquote. But there were a lot of reasons to doubt Boeing's claims. For one thing, the Starliner has had a lot of issues ever since it was first unveiled. In 2019, during its first test flight, the Washington Post reports that, quote, the Starliner's onboard computer system was 11 hours off and started executing commands for an entirely different part of the mission, which burned precious fuel. Programmers were able to send commands to the spacecraft fixing the problem, but the spacecraft never docked with the station. And then in a 2022 test flight, Starliner, quote, had some problems with its thrusters on that flight. Now, these setbacks have contributed to the financial cost of the Starliner program at Boeing, which is roughly $1.6 billion over budget. But supposedly, it was all worth it because the capsule would perform well when it counted in its final test flight this summer. And that's what Boeing had suggested to NASA. They've ironed out all the issues, all the kinks with the thrusters and the computer, everything else, and it'll work fine. Well, now that it's clear to the entire world that Boeing was wrong, NASA has just made the decision to essentially fire the company. Instead of using Boeing's Starliner to bring the 2 astronauts back home, NASA will instead use SpaceX's Dragon capsule to do the job. Taken together, all of these mishaps mean that instead of spending 8 days in space, these astronauts will be up there until at least February of next year, when SpaceX can come and get them. Now, SpaceX, of course, is the company that was founded by Elon Musk, who the Biden administration has been going out of its way to demonize and investigate at every available opportunity. But now the Biden administration needs Elon Musk to come to the rescue and avert an international catastrophe, which is why they're turning to his company for help. And this amounts to yet another extraordinary humiliation for Boeing, a company that's had no shortage of humiliations in the recent years. But what's happening at Boeing is a familiar story in corporate America, even if the company's collapse is a bit more visible than most. Boeing became extremely powerful and dominated the market after a merger. It began receiving nearly half its revenue in government contracts, making it a de facto state enterprise, basically. And the usual corruption and largesse followed. Executives became wealthy, far wealthier than their more competent counterparts at its competitor Airbus, which is headquartered in France. Meanwhile, Boeing's product became inferior and ultimately dangerous, and the government regulators who were supposed to enforce basic safety standards, like the Federal Aviation Administration, looked the other way. In fact, in the case of the Boeing MAX aircraft, the FAA outsourced a lot of its supervisory role to Boeing, They put Boeing in charge of certifying the safety of their own aircraft and their own software. And well, we all know how that turned out. Now, in the case of the Starliner, it was the job of another federal agency, NASA, to supervise Boeing, at least to some extent. And they've done a very poor job of that up to this point, as everybody can now clearly tell. And that raises an obvious question, which is, what's going on at NASA? How exactly have they gone from a space agency that landed men on the moon to a bureaucracy that can't even oversee a company like Boeing to ensure that its space capsule won't break down with two astronauts on board? Well, Tenet Media obtained this window into the culture at NASA, and I think it helps give us some explanation, some insight into what's happening right now. Watch.
And in doing this work of examining my own intentions and my own actions and their impact, I can see that there's so much more that I could have done to make the projects I've led equally welcoming to Black, Indigenous, and people of color as the white people they have engaged. I feel a lot of shame and regret about that. And I know that without looking head on at what I've done and not done, I won't be able to do better. So I'm looking forward to today's event and to this whole series as steps in my personal and professional journey to make my work more anti-racist and therefore more effective in reaching my aspiration.
And this may be a review for many of you, but these are those different characteristics that you probably see coming up a lot in our workspaces, especially in the practice of science. Perfectionism, a sense of urgency. I'm sure all of us are feeling a sense of urgency about some of the deadlines that we maybe have right now. The idea of power hoarding, the idea of individualism over collectivism, quantity over quality, either or thinking. And so all of these things can really limit the way we go about doing our work, and they can really limit the way we are able to connect with communities that come from different cultural backgrounds that don't value these things the same way that white supremacy culture values them.
Yes, objectivity is a part of white supremacy culture. Only white people are capable of being objective, apparently, is what we're told. Now, according to NASA, all of their employees should be ashamed of being white. Engaging in either or thinking makes you a bigot. So does perfectionism, being objective, having a sense of urgency. So like doing things on time and trying to do them well and holding yourself to a standard, an objective standard. Those are all under white supremacy culture on this slide. So it makes you wonder what kind of conversations were happening at NASA ahead of this latest mission. You should obviously want NASA engineers to be perfectionists. When you're talking about guiding a space capsule to dock with a space station, you want them to think either this will work or people will die. You want them to care about objectivity, and not their feelings. And that's how the old NASA was, and that's how they were able to land men on the moon with computers that are infinitely less powerful than your cell phone today. And now with far more technology at their disposal, NASA is running DEI seminars instead. They're celebrating failure and mediocrity. Now, as incredible as that footage is, it would be, premature to chalk this debacle up exclusively to DEI. The truth is, we don't know exactly who was behind this failed operation or why they were selected, but we don't have to know any of those things to make a simple and straightforward point, which is that NASA's commitment to diversity and equity should be shut down immediately. It's probably distracting from their mission, it's humiliating, and most importantly, it makes no sense. DEI is a completely insane thing to prioritize at any point, but especially when you're going into space. That's what NASA's doing. NASA's already said that with their new Artemis mission, they will, quote, land the first woman and first person of color on the moon. Now, what they never get around to explaining is, why are they doing that? Why should anyone care about the skin color and gender of the next people to step foot on the moon exactly? As far as I can tell on their website announcing the Artemis mission, NASA doesn't say anything about these people other than that there'll be a woman and a person of color. They're as dehumanized as possible, and we're supposed to think that that's somehow inspiring. With Krista McAuliffe, who died in the Challenger explosion, the idea was that she was a teacher, so she could connect with students and get them interested in space. And that was at least, something of a justification. But now we don't even get that. Now all NASA will say is that a woman and a person of color will be on board the next trip to the moon. Are you inspired yet? Now, in the old days, NASA was an agency run and operated and staffed by men. I mean, they were almost entirely men, not completely, but almost entirely. And they were men who were serious, highly skilled, highly intelligent, not to mention had balls of steel. And those are the kinds of people you need if you're venturing up into the infinite and pitiless vacuum of space. I mean, if there's any place where diversity does not matter in the slightest, if there's any place where merit and merit alone should count, it is in space, which is an environment so merciless and so hostile and so dangerous that humans cannot survive in it for 1 second without an entire network of highly advanced technology all working together perfectly. So when I was reading, this story and all this stuff about DEI at NASA, I was reminded of the tagline for the first Alien movie, which was, "In space, no one can hear you scream." And something similar applies here. As much as NASA desperately wants to pretend otherwise, no matter how many diversity Zoom calls they conduct, and no matter how much they complain about white supremacy culture, there is one unavoidable fact that NASA cannot escape. And that fact is this: in space, no one gives a damn about your diversity. And that is why NASA, for their incompetent oversight of Boeing and their pointless commitment to bringing DEI to the moon, is today canceled. If you'd like to see what else I have to say, you can access my full show by going to dailywire.com or by going to the Matt Walsh Show Twitter page. Hope to see you there. Godspeed.